Welcome to the Kimberlite webinar to take a comprehensive look at the intervention services market. My name is David Batt, President of Kimberlite Research, and I'm glad that you can join us today. This is the 27th webinar in the Kimberlite webinar series that we've hosted on behalf of the oil and gas operators globally who have participated in our industry research. These webinars are provided as a professional courtesy to the industry and to the many oil and gas operators worldwide who participate in our Kimberlite industry surveys. Our past webinars have included reviews of many of the most commonly used oil field products and services in the industry, such as directional drilling services, hydraulic fracturing, artificial lift, cementing, wellheads, formation evaluation services, and others. And we've also taken a comprehensive look at the big four oil field service suppliers, SLB, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Weatherford. And we've also taken a deep dive into the Permian Basin. Let us know if you or any one of your colleagues need access to these webinars. Send us an email or chat or message today and let us know what you need. We often collaborate directly with oil and gas operators worldwide, and we're glad to provide customized presentations to your company as needed. Just let us know. Today, I'll be taking a deep dive into the supplier performance for intervention services, including E-line, slickline, coiled tubing, tractors, and acid stimulation. Feel free to submit questions during the presentation today via the chat box, or you can email us directly, and we'll address your questions during the presentation. For those of you that are maybe not that familiar with Kimberlite Research, I will provide a brief background and then dive in for the review. Each year, Kimberlite conducts about 3,000 one-on-one interviews globally with users of oil field services. Some of you on the webinar with us today may have participated in one of our industry studies and surveys, and for that, I say thank you. We invest about 20,000 hours each year to qualify the folks that we interview globally, and our research is about 50% North America, 50% international. We produce a series of reports across the breadth of the oil field, addressing drilling, completion, production, subsea, and G&G formation evaluation. This provides us with a comprehensive understanding of the breadth of the industry. Over the last several years, we've interviewed over 17,000 users of oil field services, and we've amassed over 700,000 performance ratings on oil field service companies to benchmark the performance of the oil field service companies and run our analytics. Today, we'll be focusing on intervention services involving the use of E-line, slickline, coiled tubing, downhole tractors, and acid stimulation, based on interviews with over 180 users of oil field services globally. The performance trends that I'll be sharing with you today from 2017 through 2022 are based on interviews with over 900 users of intervention services and nearly 50,000 supplier performance ratings. The data set is rich and multidimensional. Here we cross-plot oil field service company performance on the horizontal x-axis versus pricing competitiveness on the y-axis. This value map that we refer to and will be using quite often in today's discussion is the value map, and I want to make sure everyone understands the four quadrants. Any oil field service company provider that plots in the top right-hand quadrant is viewed as a premium supplier, one that offers better than industry average performance, may charge a little bit higher price than industry norm, but costs more, but worth it. Any oil field service company supplier in the bottom right is an oil field service company that is viewed based on the user community as delivering very strong value. Bottom left, discount provider. Top left, any oil field service company provider in the top left-hand quadrant, based on the customer reviews in the user community, is viewed as competitively disadvantaged and needs to improve performance. As an oil company, as many of you know, I used to work for Chevron from the 1980s to 2003. And as an oil company, you're searching out for best value to get your jobs done. Obviously, trying to do proper due diligence and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of all the oil field service companies is something that's very important to do, to try to find oil field service companies who can meet your needs and do a good job commonly be in the top right, bottom right, or bottom left quadrant. You tend to want to try to look for alternatives to any suppliers that plot in the top left-hand quadrant. So with that, we'll dive in. Now, for intervention services that we'll be discussing today, oil and gas operators, you're using E-line, wireline, coiled tubing, or workover rigs to go in to provide a variety of services. Once a well is drilled, completed, and placed in production, eventually that well's production begins to decline due to a variety of mechanical and or reservoir issues. And we have to go in with one of these conveyance methods along with downhole tools to address these problems. So these would be the major categories that we'll be talking about today. Before we get started, I would like to kind of touch on some of the most recent activity in the marketplace that we're seeing. Certainly the first quarter is now behind us. We've seen some softening in natural gas prices. We saw that OPEC Plus about a week and a half ago cut production, along with the current policy that we have right now with the current administration. It remains supportive of the industry. But the United States land market activity has been continually revised down. When we first got our first view for 2023, back in the summer of 22, it was anticipated to drill about 14.9% more wells in U.S. land in 23 versus 22. And we've consistently revised this down to now we're looking at about 6% more wells to be drilled in U.S. land in 2023 versus 2022. Even though activity growth in U.S. land is moderating down, it's important to keep in mind that growth in the U.S. land market is moderating at very high and healthy levels following 2 years of very strong growth. Recall that we grew 36% in 22, 28.8, 29% in 21. So even though growth in the U.S. is moderating, it is moderating at high and healthy levels. When you look more broadly internationally and offshore here in this particular exhibit, you'll find that offshore and international are continuing to very durably continue investment and growth at double-digit levels. And this is expected to continue due to many years of underinvestment and the need for oil and gas operators to restore lost production capacity. And so what this translates into is the realities are the market's still relatively tight in terms of access to quality equipment and quality people, and that the oilfield service community is also focused on shareholder returns and pricing discipline and capacity discipline. It's really important for the oil companies to proactively collaborate with the oilfield service companies, not just during these tight times, but even when we hit a market downturn, to collaborate to try to align needs and resources, because we all have very finite resources. The oil and gas operators are focused on returns for the oil companies and their shareholders. The oilfield service companies are focused on shareholder returns for their investors. And so what we see here is the major oil companies and the national oil companies, if you look at the buy-in behavior where the emphasis is placed in the selection and evaluation of oilfield service companies, in 2020, price played a fairly significant role. But today, in 2022, with capacity for oilfield services being so tight in terms of access to really good quality, competent people and equipment, the major oil companies and the national oil companies are much more emphasizing quality service, technology, and performance is really key criteria that they're looking for from oilfield service companies, and consistency of performance in order to help the oil and gas operators meet their investment challenges and meet their investment needs. Now, to kick things off, intervention services is a pretty resilient space. When you look at the sentiment indices, you can see that the sentiment indices are very high numbers in the high 70s. And that intervention services is a rather stable sector for the market because there's wells that consistently need to be serviced and repaired to restore production. And so when you look at the diffusion index for intervention services from 2017 to 2022, What you basically see here is a very stable market that it does cycle with the cycles of the industry, but it doesn't cycle as hard as you see here in this exhibit with drilling and completion. Like in the downturn of 2020, we went into deep market contraction here and we dipped well below the critical 50 mark. For intervention services, it did breach into contraction mode during the 2020 year of COVID, but it didn't breach as deeply. When you take a look at the number of wells that require intervention each year, on average, it's about 20% of the wells here. It does vary by region, as you can see in the screen. And because so many wells require intervention each year, it's almost like healthcare for the oil and gas industry. There's a steady state of business, both in good times and in bad times. The biggest problems that the oil and gas operators are reporting in terms of maintaining the productivity of their wellbores in their oil and gas wells is deposit control, corrosion wax scale deposits, casing tubular leaks, sand and debris that need to be cleaned out, downhole equipment failures, dealing with packers or even artificial lift downhole pumps, water breakthrough. And as a consequence, we have about 60 to 80% of the oil and gas operators globally routinely employing these services, ranging from sand and debris removal and wellbore cleanout, perforating, tubing repairs, cement pipe evaluations, production logging, fishing services, and so forth, scale and paraffin removal. And depending upon the services that are being employed on a particular well to restore it back to production, very commonly multiple services are being performed on the well, but depending upon the services being performed, there may be a preference to use E-line, say for perforating and cement pipe evaluation, or coiled tubing for wellbore cleanout, or even slick line for bottom hole pressure temperature surveys, or actually bringing in a snubbing unit or workover rig to use drill pipe as the preferred means of conveyance for fishing services, plugging in abandonment, and such. It's also important to note that intervention services, from the operator's perspective, tend to be successful about 85% of the time. So the return on investment for oil and gas operators to restore an existing oil and gas well back to production is relatively high. There are about 6% of wells at any given time globally that are sitting idle. And they're sitting idle because, one, about half the time, 46% of the time, they're just waiting to be repaired. They've been diagnosed, but they're waiting. They're either waiting for access to quality equipment and personnel. They may be waiting due to budgetary constraints. They may be waiting just due to sheer project management. I mean, every oil and gas operator has an inventory of wells that are consistently needing to be restored and back to productivity. And so there's always a queue of wells to be treated and to be repaired. There's a small sliver, about 14%, that really still need to be diagnosed. And then the balance are typically kind of in the queue to be plugged and abandoned. And you can see that the plug and abandonment percentages of these idle wells is a little bit higher internationally and offshore than it is in North America land. Very commonly in North America land, the oil and gas operators will contract with multiple intervention service suppliers in order to get their requirements met. And this is in large measure to the fact that so many different tools and downhole tools and specialty services may be required. Conversely, when you move internationally and offshore, just due to the logistics and the tightness of the market, oftentimes the oil and gas operator will want to contract with a single supplier, say an SLB, Halliburton, Baker, or Weatherford, for example, who can coordinate both the conveyance and all the necessary downhole tools needed to perform the intervention service. Even if these integrated intervention service suppliers, they may need to contract with other third-party contractors to get the specialty downhole tools they may need, including tractors and such, in order to get the job done. When we ask the oil and gas operators which intervention service is returning the biggest gain on production, What we find is that this is an open-ended question, but we find that acid stimulation is most commonly cited amongst the oil and gas operators globally is providing the biggest, largest gain in production, or return on investment, if you will. Due to the formation damage, being able to go in with acid stimulation to clean up the perfs and to help restore and improve production is one that's being viewed very, very favorably. We also find that the oil and gas operators also cite acid stimulation as one of the services that they plan to make greater use of over the next 2 to 3 years. So we'll touch on the acid stim market as well. If we go into the market and brand image of the major intervention service providers, and in this particular discussion, we'll focus on the big four: SLB, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Weatherford. SLB's market and brand image for intervention services is strong. These large positive variances to the right reflect that SLB's market image, brand image in the marketplace for intervention services is so strong that it actually extends beyond their customer base, to where SLB is viewed as being a leader for subsea interventions, for real-time data capabilities, for high complexity jobs. And SLB is also viewed as being a premium supplier that may cost more, but is viewed as being worth it due to higher levels of performance. This negative variance indicates that not even SLB's customers associate SLB Schlumberger as being a low-cost provider. By contrast, if you look at the market brand image for Halliburton, one of Halliburton's strongest market image brand image strengths in the marketplace for intervention services is centered around being a lower cost, value-based supplier. Also viewed somewhat favorably when it comes to P&A and for having the ability to provide a basic lineup of intervention tools. Halliburton has some brand image deficits, if you will, that need to be addressed to be viewed in the marketplace as a leader for being best for subsea intervention or for fishing services or for innovative through tubing solutions. By contrast, Baker Hughes's market image and brand perception in the marketplace is centered near the 0% line, reflecting that Baker Hughes customers view Baker Hughes strongly as being a leader in these areas, but Baker Hughes's image of leadership does not really propagate or expand beyond their customer base. Baker Hughes does have some brand image deficits as it relates to real-time data capabilities, but they have some brand image strengths as it relates to subsea intervention, unlike Halliburton, and also for being a low-cost, value-based supplier, very similar to Halliburton. And Weatherford's strongest brand image strengths revolve around fishing and for being viewed as being a value-based alternative to SLB. So this slide here is a really good reflection of the big four, of how they stack up in terms of brand image. Let's take a look at the E-line slickline market really quick. When we take a look at digital slickline, what we find is that the adoption for digital slickline is growing, but not at a very fast pace. You'll see that the use and adoption of real-time digital slickline is higher internationally and offshore than it is in North America land. And even while this is a good technology, it's just too expensive amongst North America land operators, not quite seeing the value proposition and the necessity to be using it. As a consequence, the North America land operators that we interviewed for this report really do not have any plans to increase their use of digital slickline moving forward. However, the oil and gas operators in the international and offshore markets have a greater openness, if you will, to increase the use of digital slickline. So digital slickline is a great technology with many benefits. However, it's just still too costly for the North American land operators to want to increase adoption. And it's really better suited right now based on the voice of the feedback that we're receiving from the oil and gas operators for international and offshore applications. The E-line slickline market is heavily fragmented. there was a total of 88 different suppliers cited as being used globally amongst the oil and gas operators that we interviewed for this report. Oil and gas operators are using about 2 different suppliers to meet their needs for E-line, slickline conveyance. And when you get to E-line, slickline tools, again, we find that the market's very fragmented with about 63 different suppliers cited as being used. When you look at the market share in North America land, Renegade is clearly the market share leader, followed by Apollo. But for the most part, there's really not any singular supplier that really amasses a material amount of market share, and the market is heavily fragmented. When you move to international market for E-line, slickline conveyance and tools combined, SLB is the market share leader, followed by Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Weatherford, and the market tightens up with the big 4 comprising about 80% of the market. When you move offshore, again, you find that the big 3, SLB, Halliburton, and Baker Hughes, comprise a very material share of the market of about 2/3 of the market. You see that Altus down here is referenced, and the acquisition of Altus by Baker Hughes closed earlier this month in April. So Baker Hughes plus Altus can be combined to about 14%. Based on the customer reviews that we receive from the oil and gas operators, we see a very high degree of variance between the very best performing intervention service suppliers for slickline, E-line conveyance and tools, getting very high ratings on average in the 9s, and the worst performing intervention service suppliers receiving performance review ratings on average around 6 or in the 6s. This high degree of variance reflects the need for oil and gas operators to perform their due diligence to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each oilfield service provider. Each oilfield service provider has some distinctive strengths and weaknesses, and in a market that's so fragmented as it is here, it does require quite a bit of effort to do proper due diligence. But it's important because when you start to objectively benchmark performance, you can see that the industry average line is good in the sense that it's generally improving, okay, for many of these factors: responsiveness to needs, equipment quality, reliability, and such. But we also see trends to where, for example, SLBs consistently receiving customer reviews that tend to trend higher than industry average, where, say, Halliburton's customer reviews tend to trend below industry average, along with that with other suppliers as well, be it Baker Hughes or Weatherford in some cases. When it comes to pricing attractiveness and pricing strategies, you start to see some differences where Weatherford's pricing is viewed as most attractive, and Schlumberger or SLB's pricing is viewed as being the most expensive. And so this translates to these value maps to where the small to mid-tier providers in the North America land market are viewed as delivering the best overall value, with certain standouts like Go Wireline, Weatherford, and Apollo in Renegade meeting expectations of the market right in the middle of the fair value fairway here, and KLX Energy slightly underperforming. When you move to the international land market, you find that SLB is viewed as that premium supplier. Halliburton and Baker Hughes are viewed as lower cost value-based suppliers, but Baker Hughes is well positioned to grow market share along with Weatherford and some of the small to mid-tiers. When you move offshore, again, you see differentiated market with SLB positioned as the premium-based supplier, Baker Hughes and Halliburton positioned as value-based alternatives. You'll see that the small to mid-tiers, referenced here as all others, are positioned as value advantaged along with Altus, with the acquisition of Altus by Baker Hughes. In the eyes of the oil and gas operators interviewed for this report, this combination of Baker Hughes plus Altus in the eyes of the oil and gas operators will be viewed as being value accretive. Weatherford's also viewed as delivering strong value in the space offshore. When we run our statistics and calculations, what we find is that the North America land market is a little bit more price-driven for these services, whereas the international market, the oil and gas operators place greater emphasis on technology, performance, and quality service in their selection and evaluation of an intervention services provider for E-line, slickline, conveyance, and tools. Amongst the technology performance buyers and the service buyers, you can see Schlumberger SLBs viewed as the premium-based supplier, cost more but worth it. Baker Hughes and Weatherford also viewed favorably. You also see amongst the technology performance buyers that they see differentiated value in the marketplace. Pay more, get more with SLB, pay less, get less for Baker Hughes and Halliburton in Weatherford, but everyone's viewed as meeting market expectations in terms of pricing strategies and performance and value delivered. Everyone is viewed as delivering good, solid value. The price buyers, however, are questioning Schlumberger's or SLB's value proposition, and this is the one area in which SLB is most heavily competitively disadvantaged amongst this buying group in the international market. Offshore, we see more of a traditional split. Moving in the coiled tubing conveyance and tools, what we find is that digital coiled tubing, again, has a little bit higher usage rate than we see for digital slickline. We find that the coiled tubing conveyance market globally is fragmented with 117 different suppliers cited as being used globally. So clearly, there's opportunity for additional market consolidation amongst the oilfield service providers for E-line, slickline, and coiled tubing. It's great to have customer choice, but we don't really need 100 different suppliers in all cases in order to meet the needs of the industry. But the market is showing some consolidation from 2018 down to 2022. When you look at market share for coiled tubing conveyance and tools combined in North America land, the market share leaders are Through Tubing, CUD, KLX, followed by STEP, and then Baker Hughes. When you move internationally, Schlumberger, SLB, and Halliburton are the two market share leaders. You see Baker Hughes' presence growing. And when you move offshore, you'll see that, again, SLB, Halliburton, market share leaders, and Baker Hughes' presence kind of backing down a bit. Again, we see a tremendous amount of variance in performance. There's no evidence to suggest, based on the performance reviews from the oil and gas operators, that all intervention service suppliers for coiled tubing and conveyance and tools are performing at the same level. In fact, all of the evidence points elsewhere, that there's quite a bit of variability in performance amongst the various suppliers. Some, like Through Tubing Solutions, are consistently performing better than industry average every year, which is a really nice profile here. And what that results in is that Through Tubing plots in a very favorable spot in North America land as being, performing better than industry average, kind of a premium-based supplier. You see CT Partners, STEP, and KLX, and Baker Hughes, all plotting favorably amongst the customers, rating them compared to the broader group and community, where the small to mid-tiers are, pricing's on par with industry expectations and norms, but performance is slightly below industry expectations along with CUD. Moving internationally, you see a differentiated market with SLB and Halliburton occupying the top right spot, followed by Baker Hughes as a lower cost discount provider in the small to mid-tiers, value advantaged. Offshore, you see differentiated market. Again, SLB, premium, cost more but worth it. Halliburton, Baker Hughes, where we see differentiated value. This is a sign of a very healthy market. It's a sign that the oil and gas operators recognize the differentiated value that exists. That in some cases you can pay less to get less, but maybe that's sufficient to do the job. In other cases, you may need to pay more to get more in order to meet the complexities of the job. Moving on to downhole tractors, we find that downhole tractors are used in about 8% of the worldwide E-line and slickline interventions amongst the oil and gas operators that we interviewed for this report, and about 5% of coiled tubing interventions. The tractor leaders in the marketplace are SLB and Welltec, followed by Baker Hughes and Altus, but Baker Hughes and Altus are now one. So you can see very strong market penetrations here, which translated to market share. You'll see that Welltec edges out as the market share leader, followed by SLB. Baker Hughes plus Altus would equate to about 17%. We do see some performance variability, but overall, Welltec is the performance leader in tractors. SLB is pricing strategies on par with market expectations with performance that's below industry norm. and Baker Hughes and Altus are positioned as value-based alternatives in the tractor market. Moving to acid stimulation, what we find is that acid stimulation that we pointed out earlier has been cited by the oil and gas operators is providing large productivity gains in their wells. So clearly cleaning up the formation damage, cleaning up the perforations has some significant economic benefit to restoring wells' lost productivity. And about 20% of the wells globally that are being intervened require some form of acid stimulation. What we find on the market shares is the North America land market is heavily fragmented with about 25 different suppliers. So when we look at the North America land market from a market share perspective, we find companies like Petroplex and Credence and Basic and Cud and even Halliburton kind of standing out with some of the larger market shares. It's a heavily fragmented market, making up maybe the other 56% of the market. Internationally, you see the big three kind of stand out with the material share of the market share. In offshore, again, you find that the big three comprise about 80% of the market share. Again, we see strong variance in performance amongst the acid stimulation providers. You can see that when you start to track the performance of the suppliers, you'll see some that are trending below industry norm, others whose performance and customer reviews tend to trend above industry norm and industry average. So at the end of the day, when you look at the global acid stimulation market, what you'll find is that SLB is kind of viewed as that premium cost more but worth it supplier. Halliburton is a very significant player in this space and generally viewed as underperforming a little bit market expectations in aggregate on a global level based on customer reviews. Small to mid-tier suppliers are viewed as value advantaged. We do see some regional variances, like in North America land. You can see Halliburton competitively disadvantaged to those like Petroplex and Credence that are viewed by the oil and gas operators as delivering some of the better values in the marketplace in terms of performance and value. When you move internationally, you see SLB well-positioned, Halliburton underperforming in the eyes of the international land oil and gas operators interviewed. The small to mid-tiers is the value-based alternative, and Baker Hughes down as more of a discount provider. Offshore, we see kind of a differentiated market. Pay more, get more with SLB. Pay less, get less with the small to mid-tiers. But you basically have just about everybody viewed as delivering pretty solid value in the offshore market. Baker Hughes is being the most value advantaged and probably positioned to maybe gain market share moving forward. So that kind of helps sum up the intervention services supplier performance review overview. Overall, when you look at 2023, what we see in the marketplace is that the overall market for the oil and gas industry is setting up constructively with the need for some durable investment internationally and offshore in order to restore lost production capacity in the face of rising demand. You may recall that the IEA just last week raised its demand estimates for 2023 for growth to be about 2 million barrels a day more in 23 versus 22. We at Kimberlite believe that demand for oil and gas will continue to grow about 1 million barrels a year for the next decade or more, which is going to require continued commitment and investment by the operators to continue to grow and drill. It's going to be a continued investment by the oil field service companies to continue to invest in maintenance CapEx and to upgrading equipment with new technologies and capabilities. Again, I really encourage that the oil and gas operators collaborate closely with their oil field service companies or their oil field service partners. This is an industry where we're all in this together. The elevated oil prices, thanks to the accommodative policy of our administration, coupled with OPEC willing to support the market, is providing enough headroom to where both oil companies and service companies will post durable cash flows and profits this year in 2023, just like we did last year in 2022. Keep in mind that even though oil field service prices did increase significantly in 22, they were coming in off historically low pricing levels that were not healthy or sustainable. So the market's healthy today for both operators and service companies. It's incumbent upon us to continue to work together to achieve more with less. Focus on operational efficiencies, driving asset optimization. That's where we really need to focus as an industry. I'd like to thank you for participating and attending this webinar series from Kimberlite. I'd like to thank the oil and gas operators who participate in our industry surveys. We welcome your feedback, and we hope that you attend our next webinar. I think our next series of webinars will be coming out with respect to subsea services, probably in early June, followed on the heels of that with drilling services in June, and then artificial lift and production chemicals, hydraulic fracturing this summer. Thank you again for attending. Bye now.